and to celebrate our award winners. I'm slightly frightened by the concept that it's already my 16th ceremony. They seem to have flown by.
At 7:15 on the morning of December 4th, Princess Anne walked into Buckingham Palace carrying a leather portfolio that hadn't been opened in over 2 years. Inside were documents her mother never intended the world to see, at least not while certain people were still alive. By 8:30, 3 senior royals sat in stunned silence, staring at words written in Elizabeth's own hand, words that named names, settled scores, and revealed truths the monarchy had spent decades carefully burying. What Anne found wasn't just a collection of papers. It was a reckoning. Stay with us. The discovery. The discovery happened on a gray afternoon in late November, 3 days before the calendar turned to December. Princess Anne had been alone in the private apartments at Windsor Castle, overseeing what should have been a routine review of estate storage. The room was cold despite the radiator humming in the corner, and pale winter light filtered through windows that hadn't been cleaned in weeks. She was there to catalog remaining personal effects, items that had sat untouched since Queen Elizabeth's passing more than 2 years earlier. Anne moved through the task with her usual efficiency, checking inventory lists, marking boxes, ensuring nothing of historical value went overlooked. She had done this work before, understood the protocol, knew which items belonged in archives and which could be quietly distributed among family. But when she opened the narrow cabinet tucked behind a false panel in the dressing room, something made her pause. The safe was small, perhaps the size of a bread box, its surface dark green and scratched from decades of use. Anne knew her mother had kept safes in various residences, places for jewelry, important correspondence, private documents meant only for her eyes. But this one felt different. It wasn't listed in any of the formal estate records. No key had been logged with the household staff. And when Anne finally located the combination written in her mother's hand on a slip of paper tucked inside an old address book, her pulse quickened in a way she didn't expect. Inside the safe sat a single leather portfolio, burgundy with gold edging, the kind Elizabeth had favored for decades. It was tied with a black ribbon, and on the front, in unmistakable script, were the words, "To be opened only by Anne." For a long moment, she simply stared at it. Anne was not a woman easily shaken. She had spent her entire life navigating the brittle balance between duty and emotion, between what the crown required and what the heart whispered. But standing there in the cold silence of her mother's old dressing room, holding a portfolio that bore her name and no one else's, she felt something close to fear. She untied the ribbon slowly, her fingers steady despite the weight pressing against her chest. Inside were letters, perhaps 20 of them, each written on the palace stationery Elizabeth had used for private correspondence. Beneath the letters sat a sealed envelope marked with a single word, "Instructions." Anne lifted the top letter and recognized the date immediately. It had been written just months before Elizabeth's death, during a period when the Queen's health had begun to decline, but her mind remained sharp as ever. The handwriting was slower than it once had been, the strokes heavier, but the voice was unmistakably hers. "My dearest Anne," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and you are the one I trusted to carry what I could not say aloud." Anne's throat tightened. She sat down on the edge of a nearby chair, the portfolio resting on her lap, and continued reading. Her mother's words were calm, deliberate, unflinching. Elizabeth wrote about decisions she had made, regrets she had carried, truths she had chosen to bury for the sake of the institution. She wrote about Andrew, about the choices that had led to his downfall and the guilt she bore for not acting sooner. She wrote about Harry, about the rift that had opened in the family and the sorrow it caused her, even as she understood its necessity. But it was the final pages that struck Anne the hardest. Elizabeth had left instructions, clear and unambiguous, about how certain family matters should be resolved after her death. She had named Anne as the executor of these wishes, not Charles, not William, but Anne, the daughter who had always understood that duty came first, even when duty demanded sacrifice. Anne read through every letter twice, absorbing the weight of what her mother had entrusted to her. By the time she finished, the winter light outside had dimmed to near darkness. The room felt colder than before, and the silence pressed in from all sides. She closed the portfolio carefully, retying the black ribbon with hands that had begun to tremble slightly. For the first time in years, Princess Anne felt the full gravity of inheritance, not the crowns or titles or estates, but the burden of truth left behind by someone who had carried it alone for far too long. And as she stood to leave, tucking the portfolio under her arm, one thought settled into her mind with absolute clarity. This was not simply a collection of letters. It was a reckoning her mother had prepared, knowing the family would need it, knowing Anne would be the one strong enough to see it through. The question now was whether the monarchy was ready to face what Elizabeth had left behind. Why now? To understand why Anne's discovery carried such weight in early December 2025, we must step back and examine the fragile state of the monarchy during these winter months. The institution that Elizabeth had stewarded for 70 years was navigating its most uncertain period in modern history, and the pressures converging on the crown had reached a point where even carefully buried truths could no longer remain hidden. King Charles, now in the third year of his reign, had been managing the throne with a steadiness that surprised even his critics. But by late autumn, those closest to him noticed subtle changes. His schedule had been quietly adjusted. Public engagements were reduced. Medical appointments, though never discussed openly, became more frequent. The palace released no formal statements, but senior staff understood the reality. Charles was facing health challenges that required careful management, and the strain of leadership during a turbulent period was taking its toll. This placed enormous pressure on William, who found himself balancing an increasing share of royal duties while managing his own family and the ongoing complications left by Harry and Meghan's departure. Catherine, though recovering well from her own health challenges earlier in the year, remained cautious about overextending herself. The Wales family had become the public face of the monarchy's future, but the weight of that responsibility was growing heavier with each passing month. Inside the palace, discussions about the monarchy's direction had grown more urgent. William pushed for modernization, streamlining, and a leaner structure that could withstand the scrutiny of a digital age. Princess Anne, though sympathetic to his goals, worried that too much change too quickly would erode the traditions that gave the institution its meaning. Camilla, navigating her role as queen consort with unexpected grace, found herself caught between supporting Charles's vision and protecting him from the stress that came with every difficult decision. But the most significant pressure came from outside the palace walls. Public opinion, particularly among younger generations, questioned the monarchy's relevance more openly than ever before. Polling data showed declining support for the institution, especially in Commonwealth nations where conversations about severing ties to the crown had moved from fringe discussions to mainstream debate. The palace could no longer afford missteps, scandals, or unresolved controversies that reinforced the narrative of an outdated, dysfunctional family clinging to privilege. Andrew's situation remained a constant source of institutional anxiety. Though removed from public life and stripped of his titles, he continued to generate negative headlines. His relocation from Royal Lodge had been completed, but the process had been messy, drawn out, and covered extensively by international media. Every article about Andrew reminded the world of his connection to Jeffrey Epstein, and every reminder damaged the monarchy's credibility. Harry and Meghan, meanwhile, remained a polarizing presence from across the Atlantic. Their media ventures, interviews, and carefully timed statements kept the Sussex narrative alive in ways that complicated the palace's efforts to present a unified front. American audiences, particularly older viewers who remembered Diana, remained deeply invested in the couple's story, while British public opinion had grown weary of the ongoing drama. It was within this context that Anne's discovery took on such profound significance. Elizabeth had lived through decades of royal crises, from abdications to divorces to scandals that threatened the crown's very existence. She understood better than anyone how silence, when maintained too long, could become complicated. And she had witnessed firsthand how unresolved family conflicts left to fester eventually exploded in ways that damaged everyone involved. Anne suspected, though she couldn't prove it yet, that her mother had written those letters during the final months of her life precisely because she foresaw the turbulence ahead. Elizabeth knew Charles would face pressures she herself had been spared. She knew William would need guidance navigating a monarchy caught between tradition and transformation. And she knew that certain truths, particularly those involving Andrew and Harry, would eventually surface whether the family wanted them to or not. By leaving the portfolio for Anne, Elizabeth had chosen the one person she trusted to handle the contents with both discretion and courage. Anne had never sought the spotlight. She had never courted public favor or shaped her image for media consumption. She simply did the work year after year without complaint or expectation of recognition. That steadiness, that unshakable commitment to duty, was exactly what this moment required. The timing of the discovery, just days before December, felt almost intentional. The palace was preparing for the Christmas season, a period when the monarchy's public image mattered more than ever. Foreign dignitaries would be welcomed. Charitable events would be hosted. The royal family would be photographed together, projecting unity and continuity to a watching world. But beneath that carefully managed surface, fractures had been growing, and Anne, holding her mother's final instructions in her hands, understood that the facade could not hold much longer. Whatever Elizabeth had written in those letters, whatever truth she had documented, whatever guidance she had left behind, it was meant for this moment. Not 2 years ago when grief was still fresh, not 5 years from now when memories had faded. But now, in this winter of 2025, when the monarchy needed clarity more than comfort, Anne knew what she had to do. She would read every letter carefully, she would honor her mother's wishes, and she would bring the contents to Charles and William, even if doing so opened wounds the family had tried desperately to keep closed. Because Elizabeth had understood something the rest of them were still learning. Truth, no matter how painful, was always stronger than silence. The pillar of the palace. The truth was, Anne had been sensing something for months before she found the safe. Small things, easily dismissed in isolation, but collectively forming a pattern that felt increasingly deliberate. It began in early autumn during a private lunch at Balmoral, when a longtime member of the household staff, a woman who had served Elizabeth for nearly 40 years, mentioned something curious. Her Majesty was very particular about certain items in the final year, the woman had said quietly, almost hesitantly. She spent entire afternoons writing letters, sealing envelopes, organizing papers in ways we'd never seen before. When we offered to help, she'd smile and say it was something only she could do. Anne had filed the comment away at the time, attributing it to the natural preparations of someone who knew their time was limited. But the memory returned weeks later when she was reviewing estate documents and noticed several discrepancies in the inventory logs. Certain personal items Elizabeth had been known to keep were listed as transferred or relocated, but no destination was recorded. When Anne inquired, staff members exchanged uncomfortable glances and admitted they'd been instructed not to document everything. "By whose authority?" Anne had asked. "Her Majesty's," came the reply. She said some things were meant to remain private until the right time. The phrase "until the right time" lodged itself in Anne's mind. Her mother had been meticulous about royal protocol, about ensuring every artifact, every document, every piece of correspondence was properly archived. For Elizabeth to deliberately create gaps in the official records suggested intention, not oversight. The second warning sign came during a conversation with Catherine. They had been walking the grounds at Windsor on a crisp October afternoon when Catherine mentioned finding an old letter from Elizabeth among some books that had been moved from the private apartments. The letter wasn't addressed to anyone specifically, but it contained advice about navigating family conflict with grace and protecting one's integrity, even when institutional pressure demanded compromise. "It felt like she knew," Catherine had said softly, "like she understood what we'd be facing and wanted to leave something behind to help us through it." Anne had nodded, but inside her certainty was growing. Elizabeth had been preparing something, leaving breadcrumbs for those who would need them most. The third sign appeared in late October when Charles mentioned a conversation he'd had with his mother shortly before her death. They had been discussing Andrew's situation, the mounting pressure for decisive action, the painful reality that his presence was damaging the monarchy's credibility. Elizabeth had grown quiet, then said something that Charles found difficult to interpret. "There are things I should have said years ago," she told him, "things I should have documented. But the institution always came first, and sometimes the institution demanded silence." She paused, then added, "I hope when the time comes, someone will have the courage to speak the truths I could not." Charles had assumed she meant him, and suspected otherwise. By early November, Anne's instinct had sharpened into conviction. During a routine inspection of storage facilities at Windsor, she asked specifically about Elizabeth's private effects, items that had been set aside for family review. A senior archivist mentioned that one small collection remained untouched, stored in the private apartments per the late Queen's explicit instructions. "She said only Princess Anne should handle those items," the archivist explained. "No one else was to access them until you were ready." Anne felt a chill run through her that had nothing to do with the November cold. Her mother had planned this, had known Anne would eventually ask the right questions, had trusted her daughter to recognize the signs and follow them to their conclusion. The final confirmation came just days before the actual discovery. William had been reviewing communications protocols with senior staff when he mentioned finding references in old briefing notes to sealed directives that Elizabeth had prepared but never implemented. The directives were marked for release only under specific circumstances, none of which had yet occurred. "Do you know what they contain?" William had asked Anne privately. "No," she'd answered honestly, "but I suspect we'll find out soon enough." She had been right. The discovery in late November wasn't an accident. It was the culmination of a carefully constructed path her mother had laid out, knowing that Anne would be the one to walk it. Elizabeth had understood her daughter's nature, the relentless thoroughness, the inability to leave questions unanswered, the commitment to duty that would compel her to search until she found what was meant to be found. And now, standing in the dim winter light of Windsor Castle with her mother's portfolio in her hands, Anne realized the full scope of what Elizabeth had done. She hadn't simply written letters. She had created a timed revelation, one that would surface exactly when the monarchy needed it most, delivered by the one person strong enough to see it through. The warning signs had been there all along. Anne had simply needed time to recognize them for what they were, not coincidences, but invitations from a mother who knew her daughter would never ignore a call to duty, even from beyond the grave. The pressure mounts. The morning after Anne found the portfolio, she called for a private meeting. Not a formal gathering with staff and advisors present, but something smaller, more contained. She needed to share what she'd discovered with the people who would be most affected by it, and she needed to do so before word leaked through the palace's notoriously porous walls. The meeting was scheduled for 8 o'clock on December 2nd at Buckingham Palace, in a small sitting room rarely used for official business. Anne arrived first, the leather portfolio tucked under her arm, her expression composed but unmistakably serious. Charles entered minutes later, moving more slowly than usual, the weight of recent months evident in his posture. William followed, his face set in the careful neutrality he'd perfected over years of public scrutiny. Camilla arrived last, slipping into the room with the quiet grace of someone who understood when to observe before speaking. She took a seat near Charles, her hand briefly touching his arm in a gesture of support. Anne wasted no time. She placed the portfolio on the low table between them and explained where she'd found it, how it had been deliberately hidden, how Elizabeth's instructions had made clear it was meant for Anne alone. Then she opened it and began describing the contents. "Mother left letters," Anne said, her voice steady but carrying an undertone of something deeper. 23 of them, written in the final months of her life. They addressed matters she felt could not be resolved during her lifetime but believed would need resolution after her death. Charles leaned forward slightly. "What matters?" Anne met his gaze. "Andrew, Harry, the future structure of the monarchy, and specific guidance about how each of you should navigate the pressures you're facing now. The room fell silent. William's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Camilla's expression shifted from curiosity to concern. She also left instructions, Anne continued, sealed directives about actions she believed should be taken. Some are recommendations, others are more explicit. Explicit how? William asked. Anne hesitated, choosing her words carefully. She documented conversations, decisions, and events that were never made public. Things involving Andrew's behavior before the scandals broke. Things involving Harry and the circumstances surrounding his departure. She wrote about her own mistakes, choices she regretted, and truths she felt the family needed to know, even if they caused pain. Charles sat back heavily, his face pale. She kept records? In her own hand, Anne confirmed. Detailed, dated, witnessed by no one but herself, but written with the intention that they would eventually come to light. Camilla spoke for the first time, her voice low and measured. Why now? Why did she structure it this way? Anne appreciated the question. It was exactly what she'd been asking herself. I believe she knew the timing would matter. Releasing this immediately after her death would have destabilized the transition to your reign, she said, looking at Charles. But waiting too long risked the information becoming irrelevant, or the family becoming so fractured that the guidance would be ignored. And she trusted you to know when the moment was right, William said, not quite a question. Yes, Anne replied simply. The pressure in the room was palpable. Charles looked torn between wanting to know everything immediately and dreading what the letters might contain. William's strategic mind was already calculating implications, how the contents might be managed, what risks they posed, what opportunities they might offer. Camilla remained still, her eyes moving between the men, gauging reactions. There's something else, Anne said quietly. Mother wrote that she expected resistance. She anticipated that some of you would want to keep the contents private, to protect the family or preserve certain relationships. She specifically instructed me not to allow that. Charles's voice was strained. She wants this made public. Not all of it, Anne clarified, but the essential truths, the guidance about Andrew, the clarity about institutional boundaries, yes. She believed the monarchy couldn't move forward while carrying the weight of unspoken knowledge. William stood abruptly, pacing to the window. This will cause a firestorm. If the press learns that grandmother left sealed instructions about family members, about past decisions, about things we've denied or downplayed for years. They will learn eventually, Anne interrupted firmly. That's precisely Mother's point. Better to control the narrative now than to have it explode when we're less prepared. Camilla spoke again, her tone practical despite the tension. What about Andrew? Have you told him? Anne shook her head. Not yet. I wanted your agreement first on how to proceed. Charles finally found his voice, though it carried a tremor Anne rarely heard. What does she say about him? Anne opened the portfolio and withdrew a specific letter. She documents conversations where he lied to her, instances where she protected him despite knowing better, and her own guilt for not acting more decisively when the evidence first emerged. She writes that she failed him by shielding him from consequences, and she failed the institution by allowing him to remain in positions he'd already proven unfit to hold. The silence that followed was devastating. Charles closed his eyes briefly, absorbing the weight of his mother's words. William turned from the window, his expression grim but unsurprised. Camilla's hand tightened slightly on Charles's arm. There's more, Anne said quietly, about Harry, about decisions made during the Megxit negotiations, about conversations that were never disclosed. Mother was meticulous. William's voice was cold when he finally spoke. When do we read them? Anne looked at each of them in turn. Now, all of them, together, because once we leave this room, we need to be unified in how we move forward. The pressure had been building for weeks, but in that moment, as Anne began distributing the letters her mother had written, it reached its breaking point. The revelation. The reading took nearly 3 hours. Anne distributed the letters methodically, allowing each person time to absorb Elizabeth's words before moving to the next. Some letters were addressed to specific individuals. Others were general observations meant for all of them. But every page carried the unmistakable voice of a woman who had spent 7 decades navigating the impossible balance between family and crown, and who had finally chosen truth over discretion. The first letter Charles read was addressed to him personally. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the paper, and those watching saw his expression shift from apprehension to grief as he moved through the text. Elizabeth had written about the burden of monarchy, about the sacrifices required, and the loneliness that came with the crown. She acknowledged his struggles during her lifetime, the criticisms he'd endured, the patience he'd been forced to maintain while waiting decades for a role he'd been born to fill. But then her tone shifted. She wrote about his greatest weakness, his loyalty to those who did not deserve it. She named Andrew specifically, detailing conversations where Charles had defended his brother despite mounting evidence of poor judgment and worse. "You have always believed the best in people," Elizabeth wrote. "It is one of your finest qualities and your most dangerous vulnerability. Andrew has exploited that goodness repeatedly, and I failed both of you by not intervening more forcefully." Charles set the letter down carefully, his face drawn. Camilla leaned closer, reading over his shoulder, her own expression tightening as she absorbed the Queen's blunt assessment. William's letter was different in tone, but equally unflinching. Elizabeth praised his dedication to duty, his careful preparation for future kingship, his protection of Catherine and their children, but she also warned him about rigidity, about the danger of becoming so focused on institutional preservation that he lost sight of the human beings within the institution. "You are more like your grandmother than you know," she'd written. "You understand sacrifice. You accept hard choices. But remember that the crown exists to serve the people, not the other way around. Do not let the weight of responsibility make you cold." The letter continued with specific guidance about Harry. Elizabeth acknowledged the pain of their estrangement but wrote with surprising clarity about the necessity of boundaries. "Your brother chose a different path, and you cannot save him from the consequences of that choice. Loving someone does not mean carrying them when they refuse to walk. Let him go, William. Not with anger, but with peace." William read the passage twice, his throat working as he swallowed hard. The words were permission he hadn't realized he needed, validation from the one person whose opinion carried absolute weight. Anne's own letter was brief but profound. Elizabeth thanked her for a lifetime of steadfast service, for never seeking recognition, for doing the work without complaint or expectation. "You are the backbone of this family," the Queen had written. "And when the moment comes, you will be the one strong enough to carry what I could not. Trust yourself, Anne. You have never failed me." But it was the letters about Andrew that proved most devastating. Elizabeth had documented specific incidents spanning decades, moments when Andrew's behavior had raised concerns but been quietly managed to avoid scandal. She wrote about the warnings she'd received from staff, from security personnel, from diplomatic contacts who reported troubling conduct during official visits. She detailed conversations where Andrew had lied directly to her face, then later been proven dishonest. The most damning letter described a meeting in late 2019, shortly after the Epstein allegations resurfaced publicly, but before Andrew's disastrous BBC interview. Elizabeth had confronted him privately, demanding complete honesty about his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein and the accusations being made. Andrew had assured her the claims were baseless, that he'd maintained only superficial social contact with Epstein, that there was nothing to worry about. "I knew he was lying," Elizabeth wrote. "I could see it in his eyes, hear it in the careful way he chose his words. But I allowed myself to be convinced because the alternative, accepting that my own son had behaved so recklessly, was too painful to bear. That failure of courage is one I will carry to my grave." She went on to describe the aftermath of the BBC interview, her shock at the extent of his poor judgment, and her agonizing decision to strip him of titles and remove him from public life. But even then, she wrote, she had been too gentle, too willing to allow him dignity he had not earned. The monarchy cannot survive if we protect wrongdoing out of familial loyalty, she concluded. Andrew should have faced fuller consequences years ago. I chose the institution's reputation over justice, and that choice haunts me. Do not repeat my mistake. Charles read that letter with visible pain, his hand pressed briefly to his forehead. William's expression had turned to stone, but his eyes reflected something that looked like vindication. Anne remained outwardly calm, but those who knew her well could see the tension in her shoulders, the weight of carrying her mother's confessions. The letters about Harry were equally difficult, though less focused on wrongdoing and more on sorrow. Elizabeth wrote about watching the rift develop between the brothers, about her failed attempts to mediate, about her sympathy for Harry's struggles balanced against her disappointment in his choices. She acknowledged Meghan's difficulties adjusting to royal life, but noted instances where drama could have been de-escalated and wasn't. They were not entirely wrong in their grievances, Elizabeth wrote, but they were catastrophically wrong in how they chose to address them. Burning bridges may feel like liberation in the moment, but it leaves you isolated on the far shore. I fear Harry will discover this truth when it's too late to rebuild. The final document in the portfolio was the sealed envelope marked Instructions. Anne opened it last, reading aloud so everyone could hear simultaneously. Elizabeth's directives were clear and specific. The truth about Andrew's behavior should be disclosed to trusted historians preparing official royal records. Harry should be offered one final private meeting to reconcile, but if declined, the family should move forward without him. And most importantly, the monarchy should prioritize transparency over tradition when the two came into conflict. The world has changed, Elizabeth wrote in her final paragraph. The institution I inherited could survive through mystique and distance. The institution you inherit must earn trust through honesty. Do not hide from difficult truths. Face them, address them, and move forward with integrity. When Anne finished reading, the room remained silent for a long moment. Outside, December rain had begun falling against the windows, a steady rhythm that filled the quiet. Charles sat with his head bowed. William stared at the letters spread across the table. Camilla's face was unreadable, but her hand remained steady on Charles's shoulder. Finally, Anne spoke. She's given us permission to be honest. The question is whether we're brave enough to use it. The blow-up. The explosion came not during the reading, but in the hours that followed. By early afternoon on December 2nd, the contents of Elizabeth's letters had spread through the inner circle like a contagion. Andrew had been summoned to Buckingham Palace, arriving with the defensive posture of a man who already suspected bad news. When Anne handed him the letters his mother had written about him, the color drained from his face. He read in silence at first, his breathing growing heavier with each page. The room where they'd gathered, a small private study near the king's apartments, felt as though it was shrinking. Charles sat across from his brother. William stood near the window, and Anne remained positioned by the door, as if anticipating the need to block an exit. When Andrew finally looked up, his eyes were red-rimmed but blazing with something that looked like betrayal. "She wrote this?" His voice cracked. "Mother actually documented all of this?" "In her own hand," Anne confirmed quietly. "Dated, detailed, intended to be part of the permanent record." Andrew's hand shook as he set the letters down. "She believed I lied to her? She thought I was reckless, dishonest?" He looked at Charles desperately. "You know that's not how it was. You know the media twisted everything, made it worse than it was." Charles's voice was heavy with exhaustion. "Andrew, she documented specific conversations, dates, times, what was said. This isn't speculation. This is what she experienced with you." "Then she misunderstood." Andrew's voice rose sharply. "She was elderly. She was—" "Do not finish that sentence," Anne cut in, her tone like steel. "Mother's mind was clear until the very end. You know that. We all know that." Andrew stood abruptly, pacing the room like a trapped animal. "So what is this? Some kind of posthumous verdict? She waits until she's gone to condemn me because she didn't have the courage to do it while she was alive?" William turned from the window, his voice cold and precise. "She's giving us the truth you've spent years trying to bury. She's documented your lies, your failures, your damage to this family. And she's done it because she knew you'd never take responsibility on your own. Responsibility? Andrew spun toward him. You want to talk about responsibility? You've been waiting for years to push me out completely. You and Anne, with your perfect duty, your perfect service. You've never understood what it's like to be the spare, to be dismissed, to face consequences? Anne interrupted sharply. Is that what you were going to say? Because yes, Andrew, we've never understood what it's like to behave recklessly and then demand protection from the fallout. Andrew's face flushed with anger. I served this country. I was a naval officer. I did my duty for decades, and one mistake, one association I couldn't have known would— One? William's voice was lethal. She documented years of concerns, staff reports, diplomatic complaints, warnings from security personnel. This wasn't one mistake, Andrew. This was a pattern you've spent your entire adult life perfecting. The room fell into a tense silence. Andrew looked at Charles, searching for an ally, some hint of the brother who had defended him for so long. But Charles's face was drawn, aged by the weight of their mother's words. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. She was right, Andrew, about all of it. I've known it for years, and I protected you anyway. I let my loyalty blind me to what everyone else could see. He paused, his hands trembling slightly. Mother's letters aren't just about you. They're about my failure too. My refusal to act when I should have. Andrew stared at him, something crumbling behind his eyes. So you're abandoning me now? After everything? I'm accepting the truth, Charles said quietly. Something I should have done long ago. That was when Andrew truly broke. Not with tears, but with a kind of desperate fury that comes when someone realizes they've lost the last protection they had. Fine, he spat. Release the letters. Let the world see what she really thought. Let them read every damning word. But don't pretend this is about truth or justice. This is about erasing me completely, making sure there's no way back. Anne's voice remained steady. There was never a way back, Andrew. The moment you lied during that interview, the moment you couldn't account for your actions, the moment you put your reputation above the victims, there was no way back. Mother understood that. She documented it so the rest of us would understand it too. Andrew grabbed the letters from the table, his movements sharp and uncontrolled. And what about Harry? Did she write about him with this same contempt? Did she dissect his failures with this much precision? She wrote about him with sorrow, William said flatly. There's a difference. Harry made choices we disagree with, but they weren't criminal. They weren't predatory. Don't compare your situation to his. Andrew's laugh was bitter, hollow. Of course not. Harry gets sympathy. Harry gets understanding. And I get erased from history with my own mother's testimony as the knife. He moved toward the door, but Anne stepped slightly to block his path. Where are you going? Away from here, Andrew said, his voice shaking. Away from all of you. You want me gone? Consider it done. Andrew, Charles began, rising from his chair, but Andrew was already pushing past Anne, the letters clutched in one hand, his other hand reaching for the door. Don't, he said without turning back. Don't try to soften this now. You made your choice, she made hers, and I'll live with mine. The door closed behind him with a finality that echoed through the study. For a long moment, no one moved. Charles sank back into his chair, looking older than he had that morning. William remained at the window, his jaw tight. Anne stood by the door, her hand still raised as if she might call Andrew back, though they all knew she wouldn't. Camilla, who had been sitting quietly in the corner throughout the confrontation, finally spoke. He'll never forgive any of you for this. No, Anne agreed softly. He won't. Outside, the December rain continued its steady fall, washing away nothing, changing nothing, simply marking the moment when the fracture in the family became a chasm no bridge could ever cross again. The fallout. The decision to go public came swiftly, though not without anguish. By the evening of December 3rd, the inner circle had reconvened at Buckingham Palace to determine how much of Elizabeth's revelation should be shared with the world. The debate was sharp, painful, and revealed fault lines that had been forming for months. William argued for transparency. If we don't control this narrative, someone else will. The letters exist, staff know about them. Eventually details will leak, and when they do, we'll look like we were hiding something. Charles resisted, his voice weighted with sorrow. These are our mother's private thoughts, her personal reflections on family matters. Do we truly have the right to expose them? She gave us that right, Anne countered firmly. She wrote them specifically to be disclosed. She wanted the truth documented, not buried with her. Camilla offered a different perspective, one shaped by her own history of public scrutiny. Partial disclosure might be worse than full transparency. If we release some details but withhold others, people will assume we're hiding the most damaging parts. The palace communications team presented polling data showing that public trust in the monarchy had declined steadily over the past year. Scandals involving Andrew, ongoing tensions with the Sussexes, and questions about the institution's relevance had all contributed to growing skepticism, especially among younger demographics. But older viewers, particularly in America, still hold deep respect for the late Queen, one advisor noted. If they learn she left guidance for the family, guidance that addresses unresolved controversies, it could actually strengthen public confidence. By midnight, a consensus had formed. The palace would release a carefully crafted statement acknowledging the discovery of Elizabeth's private letters and summarizing their key themes without revealing every detail. The statement would confirm that the late Queen had documented concerns about family matters, had provided guidance for future leadership, and had emphasized the importance of accountability and transparency. The announcement was scheduled for 7:15 on the morning of December 4th, a timing chosen to reach both British breakfast news and late-night American broadcasts. As the communications team finalized the wording, William made one final request. Catherine should be informed before this goes public. She's been pulled into enough situations without warning. Anne nodded her agreement. Catherine had earned her place as a trusted confidant, someone whose judgment had proven sound during previous crises. She deserved to know what was coming. The statement, when finalized, was remarkable for its restraint. It confirmed that Princess Anne had discovered a collection of private letters written by Queen Elizabeth during her final months. It stated that the letters addressed family matters, institutional concerns, and provided guidance for future decision-making. It acknowledged that some contents would be shared with historians and archivists as part of the official royal record, while others would remain private to protect individuals not directly involved in public life. Most significantly, it included a single line that would dominate headlines for weeks. Her Majesty's writings reflect her enduring commitment to truth, accountability, and the long-term stability of the Crown. That phrase, truth and accountability, was deliberate. It signaled that the monarchy was embracing a new standard, one that prioritized honesty over image management. By dawn on December 4th, the statement sat ready for release. Staff had prepared briefing materials for foreign governments, coordinated with Commonwealth offices, and alerted key media contacts. The palace had braced itself for the storm that would inevitably follow. Anne stood alone in the early morning darkness, watching the first light break over London's skyline. In a few hours, her mother's voice would echo across the world one final time, not through speeches or public appearances, but through words written in private, intended for a moment exactly like this. The reckoning Elizabeth had prepared was about to begin.